A couple of quick comments as we're loading up, and thanks to our incredible team from Vascular Cures staffing the breakout sessions and taking notes for us so that we can come back in the room and dialogue. I just wanted to talk a little bit about how we as a group bring this all back together after the meeting, and historically at least, how we push it forward. So typically we will get back together amongst our small group and our scientific advisors and also our board, and we'll discuss what we learned today and think about what we would put out as a request for proposals for pilot projects. And typically, as Isabel had noted earlier, we have historically been able to fund 1 or 2 pilot projects. It's sort of that range of scale. We have prioritized projects that involve collaborators from more than one institution, that involve patient-centric goals, very broadly stated. What you heard already today is the breadth of different types of things we funded range from very translational science to bioinformatics to, implementation science even. So we have a very broad thinking process about what, we want to catalyze really to focus or to advance vascular care, and so it's not prescriptive at all. But we do want to consider innovation, collaboration, things that wouldn't otherwise be easily doable. Maybe they're high-risk projects that are just hypothesis generating. Those are a good fit. And so all that will come out afterwards when we generate sort of an RFP that we'll send out to everyone in the room. First, the goal of this next part is to sort of distill what some of the ideas were and to get some real vigorous input or discussion around it. So, Minesh, you want to come up and start with your group?
Yeah, I'll just say thanks, everybody, again. And I think they're putting up the slide. We had a really great conversation. People were really engaged and felt like we had a broad-ranging conversation. It took us a while to get to our priority areas that you're going to see here in a second. But just to remind everyone, we were in Group 1, which is leveraging systems and data in patient-centered ways to explore hypotheses. And so, a couple of different things. I'll just say first, this isn't the order the conversation went, but I'll start with it. So the first was maybe the second bullet, which was a conversation about we all in practice see patients that are phenotypically different. We've spent a lot of time today talking about GLP-1s and metabolism, but there'll be patients that we've heard have biologic processes, whether it's in the abdominal aorta or the renal patients, or the patients with PAD that may have a lipid-rich plaque or a calcific plaque or may have an inflammatory cause. And so just better differentiating phenotypes of patients with vascular disease and engaging them to do that would be valuable. There was a really interesting conversation about vascular disease and hormone replacement therapy for women and men who take testosterone at that age. And there's really just an interesting conversation about how that space, and maybe even people who are trying to make that decision, middle age, who are accelerating or not accelerating vascular disease or may have differential risk, may be a really important biologic question for people and patients that hasn't been answered, even though we reviewed sort of the observational data and the Women's Health Initiative, et cetera. So there were some really interesting thoughts there that would get people engaged. The third bullet is something I think Vascular Cures thinks a lot about. We want to understand what the science is, which is how do we engage and empower people from different geographic served and underserved areas to better know about their health and get better vascular care. And there's a broad-ranging conversation about maps and activating people in different ways, and how would we study that, and are there ways to get patients engaged in that. The fourth one was an interesting one, which is just the conversation of adherence. We talked a lot today about different therapeutics. How do you get adherence? And the group thought that, is there combination therapy? Is that a place for Vascular Cures to help push people? Because people, if they get to participate in care and say, if I could have one pill that did these 2-3 things rather than the actual number of different pills I'm taking, or a shot, and both that's maybe patient preference, but it will also be something that the industry that's developing these things would be interested in, because there are reasons they're not doing combo pills, which we could overcome, and there are reasons that they might be able to get things that would work. At least that's the conversation. Now, we fully realized that we were sitting there in a group talking about patient-centered priority areas, and we did have patient representatives here today and also had some in the conversation, but we thought, here are some areas of concern and debate amongst the group, which were, how do we get different systems to obviously people want to collaborate, but how do you get people's different data systems to collaborate or to engage, and how do you share that data easier? And yes, we talked a lot about AI and AI ways of doing things, but how do you have, if two different systems have two different platforms and they're doing those things, how does that work? How much information is too much or just right for people? Another conversation about empowering people is like, oh, you could give them so much information, they're swimming in it, not enough. Or the map conversation led to, well, if I'm in a place where everybody does poorly, maybe you're empowering them, or maybe they're feeling a little fatalistic and not wanting to do things. So how do you engage that? And then how do we deliver therapy in ways that impacts the most vulnerable patient population? So if we're doing the maps and we're doing these things, but we're not getting to the people that still are at the highest risk, and are there different ways to touch them, and what's the evidence or science? Are there, and interesting questions with Vascular Cures, have you partnered with legal groups? Have you partnered with groups that might empower people in different sort of statutory or other ways? And then what's the best way to retrieve information from patients? So we had somebody, I think a few people talk about, obviously the Vascular Cures Facebook group and others, and maybe going directly in this process to them and saying, what are the burning questions or platform questions you all are dealing with, and think about. Some of that might be a supplement, some of that might be a question around status, some of that might be a walk-in question. Whatever those are, they might actually build us the empowered group that might help us with one of the priority research areas. Fundamentally, there was a lot of interest in basic to translational biology tied to clinically phenotypical patients that we see, and we're obviously trying to engage patients to help us answer that and see what their interest is. I went through that pretty quickly. Anybody from group one want to add some things to that short review of our hour, what felt, I'm sure, like 3 hours meeting? Okay, thanks. I don't know if, Mike, you're up next, and then we'll have Matt, and then we'll come back and summarize.
Let me get up the next slide, I think. Okay. So our group was thinking about how these clinical trials that we heard about this morning both provide opportunities for additional research, but also the questions that they opened up in our minds about, what's actually happening, how do these drugs work or not work, and in which patients do they work. So there's a lot of discussion, of course, around these GLP-1 RA trials because they produce these kind of surprising results, which you heard about this morning, but this shouldn't be taken as exclusive to those drugs in particular. But really, a large part of the conversation honed around, can we dig in a little bit more to the mechanisms in any way with any kind of pilot studies to explore what's exactly happening to the patients in their vasculature that would explain the benefits on their vascular outcomes. So broadly speaking, mechanistic studies which could either leverage samples or data or images that are already collected in the trials by inquiring from the PIs or the sponsors for access to that data, or that might basically be a de novo small prospective study, even a crossover trial of a small scale where you would probe a specific mechanistic endpoint or outcome with some novel measurement, like, for example, measuring something in circulating biomarker or some microvascular functional test to sort of prove the hypothesis or relate it. There was some discussion around, examining the impact of some of these drugs on diabetic foot disease and wound healing specifically, pretty much still not really well known. What biomarkers would be specific to that, and a lot of discussion around how to maybe measure microvascular function, since that was brought up a lot today, but we don't have an available way to do it in the clinic or at the bedside. Discussion centered around bringing things like brachial artery flow-mediated dilation as a tool, or perhaps other ways of measuring microvascular function, and to prove whether or not that's the mechanism. I'm going to jump down to, there's also a lot of discussion about testing this hypothesis that actually it's all about inflammation, or proving it by sort of showing whether or not the impact on inflammatory biomarkers is an explanatory surrogate measure for the impact of the drugs. So looking at things like CRP, IL-6, and other inflammatory biomarkers, or looking at other circulating materials, even exosomes came up as a way to sort of test for or to generate new hypotheses about how the drugs are working, whether or not they're actually targeting inflammation. We talked about the DFC, Diabetic Foot Consortium, as another source of opportunities for investigation. It came up a lot today, but there are data that's intentionally collected there, and there's data that can be obtained or probed, including some of this medication data, and accessing blood, urine, or tissue samples for your biomarker of interest with a specific hypothesis. And then we also talked a little bit about implementation projects. We were sort of brainstorming around how great it would be to have a dashboard specific to vascular health or vascular patients that included not just blood pressure and lipid profile, but included other measured things about their metabolome, perhaps their diet, perhaps a self-reported 6-minute walk test, things that would sort of integrate their vascular function with their metabolic and cardiovascular health. Some areas or obstacles and concerns, the fact that in the trials that we heard about today, mostly did not represent patients with the most advanced stages of PAD. Where PAD was included, it was generally people with claudication. It wasn't a patient with limb-threatening ischemia. And wound healing in general is underrepresented in the existing drug trials. It's sort of treated as a separate thing altogether. But why? Because systemic therapies are also likely to have an impact on wound healing as well. The lack of readily available biomarkers to assess the microvasculature was brought up. And then one interesting question that came up was whether or not people in this room should try to create their own consortium to better create some prospective studies to work together or to share data. And we shared some, experiences around that. In our foundation, we had found it was simpler to fund people to do the work, but not try to manage their data or their samples, just because it's very complicated as well as expensive to sort of do that. We have done that. NIH has done that. DFC has done that. They sort of have a central biorepository. But at our scale, it's sort of been simpler for us to just fund the people to do the work, but share the data themselves and own the data and the work themselves. In any case, those are sort of the discussion points that we had. I don't know who else was with us. Mark, I see you're in the back, and other folks in the room today. Leave anything out that anyone wants to bring up? Okay. And who's doing the third group? Matt?
All right. We had a great discussion in group 3. We were tasked with defining benefits and challenges for patients, which is fairly broad, and there was certainly some overlap with the other group discussions. Trust building and measurement came up as a priority area. I guess that's also kind of a concern or barrier. We discussed all the different domains where this trust factor comes in. There was discussion today about trust of artificial intelligence technology, as well as trust about participating in a research study, as well as trust about going to see a clinician because of fear of being experimented upon or just lack of adequate information. And I guess that's the other one, trust of information. We talked a lot about best practices for educational interventions to support not only clinical practice, but research programs. There was a lot of interest in very short format videos as an educational resource. We discussed examples of how availability of a video not only contains the information in a very digestible way, but also might let the learner navigate themselves toward a person that looks like them or that they find more trustworthy for whatever reasons they bring with them. And also the need for educational resources around some topics that might be very basic and mundane. Our colleagues from Los Angeles were talking about their most frequently watched video. They have these short less than 1 minute videos is how to put on a compression stocking. And so what is the starting point, or how do we get a list of almost like a FAQ list for patients to choose from a menu and pick a small dose of education rather than a program at a time? There was also a lot of discussion early in the meeting about these video resources from our industry partners, where they create a resource for a potential clinical trial participant to refer to what it's going to be like to be in this research trial and what's the ask of me. But we were wondering if maybe having some actual patients instead of doctors giving that education might build trust and also build enthusiasm to enroll. We talked about leveraging non-clinician partners for educational interventions, specifically other patients in addition to nurse educators and pharmacists, which came up today due to time constraints and also the need for these non-clinicians to, we need the physicians to more actively partner with these educators and in a structural way, kind of hand one off to the other. And there was also a lot of discussion around the need for community-based programs to share lessons in cultural competency and best practices for what works, because that's important in terms of enrollment and implementation. And finally, the bottom bullet point there was a lot of discussion around access challenges. So it's great if we can do a screening intervention and show somebody that they have a high CRP. If that individual gets that information, we almost need a navigator type resource for them for where do I go with this? Where do I go for this if I don't have a primary care physician? What do I do if I want to see a specialist if I can't? What do I do if my insurance program doesn't cover a GLP-1 agonist and I really wish I could have one? So a lot of discussion around pairing patients up with the information they need and who's going to give it to them. We were also the only group that climbed 2 flights of stairs. I'm going to point that out. So we're ahead of you on the steps. Group 3, any big topics I omitted or misrepresented? Okay, thank you.